Good evening. I'm Lois Oppenheim, the program chair of NIPSI, and I'd like to welcome you to tonight's panel entitled Strife and Excellence, Turning Points in the History of the New York Psychoanalytic Society and Institute. The objective of this meeting is a consideration of changes in policy, in practice, and in thinking about psychoanalysis that have served, or at times perhaps disserved, this institution. The oldest psychoanalytic society in the United States, dating to its founding in 1911 by Abraham Brill, the first translator of Freud's writings into English, the society added to its membership as increasing numbers of Americans who studied in Vienna, Budapest, and Berlin returned to the U.S. A first series of courses was created in 1922, and an educational committee was formed a year later to organize the society's instructional curriculum. A personal analysis, seminars, and case supervision constituted the basis of training, and the New York Psychoanalytic Institute was established by the Society in 1931 with its first educational director, Sandor Rado, recruited from Berlin to be at the helm. As is well known, Hitler's rise to power resulted in the emigration of many preeminent European analysts, a number of whom became instrumental in determining the early intellectual and educational trajectory of the Institute in accordance with the tenets of ego psychology and in cooperation with Anna Freud. They included Heinz Hartmann, Ernst Kris, Rudolf Lowenstein, Edith Jacobson, Robert Bach, Kurt Eisler, with Berta Bornstein, Marianne Kris, and Margaret Mahler leading the way with child analysis. From its establishment in 1946 of the Veterans Mental Hygiene Clinic to what we know today as the Treatment Center, from a training limited to medical practitioners to that of numerous others as well, from its fundamentally Freudian curriculum to its expansion somewhat beyond and the creation of a research center, a center for interdisciplinary roundtable discussions, a center for neuropsychoanalysis, and a parent-child center, the New York Psychoanalytic Society and Institute has traveled a very long road. Tonight, our panel of distinguished analysts will address this journey and its meaning with regard to the future of the field. Drs. Harold Blum and Leon Balter will moderate the panel and are joined by Dr. Sander Abend, Anton Kris, and Theodore Shapiro. Dr. Blum is a training and supervising analyst at the Institute for Psychoanalytic Education affiliated with New York University School of Medicine. He is the former director of the Sigmund Freud Archives and the author of several books and more than 165 papers. Dr. Blum was the inaugural Sigourney Award winner given by the American Psychoanalytic Association. He is past editor-in-chief of the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association, past vice president of the International Psychoanalytical Association, and he has given numerous national and international honorary lectures, including the Freud, Hartmann, Mahler, and Brill, among others. Dr. Balter, who has had lengthy hospital appointments, first at Bronx Municipal Hospital Center and then at Manhattan Psychiatric Center, as well as academic appointments at Johns Hopkins, Albert Einstein College of Medicine, Mount Sinai School of Medicine, and elsewhere, is a training and supervising analyst at the New York Psychoanalytic Institute. He is a member of the editorial board of the Psychoanalytic Quarterly and has been the recipient of numerous awards and honors, most notably the 2007 Greta Herman Award for Excellence in Resident Education, given by the Department of Psychiatry, Mount Sinai School of Medicine, the 2009 Edith Sabshin Award for Excellence in Teaching Psychoanalysis, offered by the American Psychoanalytic Association, and the 2012 Charles Brenner Award for Exceptional Contributions to a Psychoanalytic Education here at the New York Psychoanalytic Institute. Dr. Balter has authored numerous papers that have appeared in the Psychoanalytic Quarterly, the International Review of Psychoanalysis, the Psychoanalytic Study of the Child, the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association, and the International Journal of Psychoanalysis, to name but some. And he continues to write prolifically on a wide variety of subjects. Dr. Abend, who attended the New York Psychoanalytic Institute in the late 60s, is a training and supervising analyst here and has taught a number of courses at this institute for many years. He has also served as president of the society, as well as serving the American Psychoanalytic Association in several capacities, including secretary of the association. Similarly, Dr. Abend has been an integral part of the International Psychoanalytical Association and has been on its board of directors. He has published widely, is a past editor-in-chief of the Psychoanalytic Quarterly, where he is currently on the board of directors, and he has given the Brill Lecture, the plenary lecture of the American Psychoanalytic Association, the Freud Lecture, and a number of others, both in the U.S. and abroad. Dr. Kris is a clinical professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. He has been a psychiatrist for over 50 years, a psychoanalyst for over 40 years, and a training and supervising analyst at the Boston Psychoanalytic Society and Institute for over 30 years. He is the author of Free Association, Method and Process, and numerous papers. Dr. Kris has served on the editorial boards of several of the major psychoanalytic journals and on the board of trustees of the Anna Freud Center, the Sigmund Freud Archives, and the Anna Freud Foundation. Dr. Shapiro is professor emeritus at the Weill Cornell Medical College and training and supervising analyst at the New York Psychoanalytic Institute. He has lectured widely, focusing on the interplay of linguistics, development, and psychoanalytic theory and practice, and has collaborated on many empirical studies of language and affect in early infantile autism, normal development, and most recently studies of hypnosis and neuroscience. Dr. Shapiro was editor of JAPA, 1983 to 1993, book editor of The International, 1993 to 2001, and program chair of the 1999 biennial meeting of the International Psychoanalytic Association meeting in Santiago, Chile. He has given the Brill and Hartman lectures at this institute and the Rado lecture at the Columbia Psychoanalytic Association, the plenary address at the 2002 American Psychoanalytic Association meeting, and the Philip Wilson Memorial Lecture at PANI. Dr. Shapiro is the recipient of many prizes in child and adolescent psychiatry. I am sure we are in for a most interesting discussion, and I'll now turn the mic over to Dr. Blum to get us started.
First, I want to thank Lois Oppenheim and the program committee for the privilege and honor of being on this panel tonight. And I also want to tell you how delighted I am to be here, literally and figuratively. Can you all hear me? I hope that the hoarseness I have from my last chemo won't interfere, but let me know. This institute and society were the first in this country, as Lois mentioned. In 1911, A.A. Brill and Clarence Obendorf founded the New York Psychoanalytic Society. They refused to join the blossoming American Psychoanalytic Association, which was actually founded 3 years later. There's a whole story I don't have time to go into, but it's quite remarkable that Obendorf participated in that because he had had a very unhappy antagonistic analysis with Freud just before coming over to found the New York Psychoanalytic Society. In 1931, Rado was drafted to come here, which would create later problems because he had been Heinz Hartmann's first analyst. And the ego psychology and the problem of adaptation was a later rendition, in some ways, of Rado's adaptive viewpoint. Now, the pioneer analysts closely associated with Freud, with his coterie, who had been either analyzed or supervised by Freud or by Anna Freud, were really a remarkable group. About 40 of them came over in the late 30s and early 40s, some of them having to dodge the Nazi U-boats. And they were, in some ways, which some of them couldn't really deal with, both denigrated and humiliated refugees fleeing Nazi Germany and desperate to get out. And in other ways, highly idealized when they arrived. When they arrived, they were greeted very ambivalently, depending who they were. It really wasn't a problem, although some of these people were lay analysts, and there were warnings at the time about lay analysts not being accepted. And there were non-ideological problems in terms of the theory and practice of psychoanalysis. But the group that came so closely associated with Freud himself felt that they had a particular mission. Their mission was to preserve and protect psychoanalysis. They were the torchbearers. They saw themselves as the anointed ones. And indeed, they were looked upon that way by many of the Americans who so ambivalently greeted them. What I mean by that is some of them were told that it would be very fine for them to settle right here in Manhattan, and others like Margaret Mahler and some of the others were told to try Buffalo, Utica, and so forth. I remember very clearly about 15 years ago, there was a meeting of the so-called diaspora in Aix-en-Provence, and I was giving a paper there about the flight of the European analysts. And before I went to France, I had a telephone call. This will give you an idea of what was involved. This lady called, and her name was Miss E. Blum. So I said, "Are you a relative?" She said, "Possibly, I don't know. But that's my married name. My maiden name is Spitz. I'm the daughter of Rene Spitz." She said, "I want you to know the kind of reception we got. It was red carpet. The president of the New York Psychoanalytic came to greet us." And this was a very different situation from what Margaret Mahler described to me and many others about the way they were greeted and told, in effect, to go elsewhere. There was sociological, psychological, and economic concerns. Fees were very low at the time. Jack Orlow was getting $4 a session, jealous of Leo Rangel for getting $5, as he told me. I would hear about this in great detail from Jack because not only was my initial mentor, but we became very close friends and confidants and exchanged all kind of information about the growth, development, and the problems of the New York Institute. I was a grandson. All my teachers, supervisors, my analysts were graduates and retained their membership in the Institute. In a way, being a grandson was unusual because I was privy to many discussions that the parents and children would not have with each other. So this led to a reconsideration on my part of what really went on at the time. Perhaps it was inevitable, but the people who had not really been able to deal with their humiliation and denigration as poor refugees found themselves highly idealized. And many of the Americans, some of the leading Americans, had actually been their students in Europe who had gone over for 9 months and studied with the senior analysts who were then coming over. In addition, a number of the younger Americans had been drafted or had joined the military service during World War II, and they were first coming back. There was mutual admiration and mutual suspicion. There was idealization and denigration on both sides. The torchbearers, the anointed ones, were very, in their own way, and I have to say this because I think it's historically accurate, they were somewhat supercilious towards the Americans whom they regarded as not being really cultured, sharing Freud's ideas that the Americans were somewhat uncultured compared to the Europeans, and that their knowledge of psychoanalysis not stemming directly from Freud, or at least from Anna Freud, didn't compare to what they could bring. In addition, as I said, they thought that their mission here was to protect and preserve psychoanalysis and to further develop it. The leader, Heinz Hartmann, made very important contributions, and at the same time, as we'll see, he has almost disappeared from the literature. He's hardly ever cited today. What they introduced were three major, I think, contributions that deserve to be carefully thought about. First, they changed the curriculum and the entire structure of education in this august institute and spreading to the rest of the country, but not throughout the world. Ego psychology, structural psychology was American. The rest of the world was going Kleinian, Bionian, Lacanian, and so forth. Here in the United States, and particularly in New York, the group that came over introduced the whole idea of a progression committee, an admissions committee, a formal graduation, instruction, faculty appointments, and the selection of training analysts. That would later become a particular problem. But in terms of contributions, their influence on analytic education was enormous. In addition, Hartmann introduced the idea of a developmental progression as follows. He talked about ego autonomy, bringing in what we've now considered to be the neurobiological foundations of the ego, stressed the reality principle, and the growth towards the possibilities of adaptation to the environment. In order to do that, although it was called ego psychology, they really adhered to structural theory, and they actually began to go beyond where Freud had been. Hartman's idea of primary autonomy and then secondary autonomy today would probably be discussed in terms of the inherited neurobiological foundations of the ego and developmental transformations. That was all new. Ego psychology stressed several aspects that had not really been prominent in Freud's own later work, even though the seeds were all there. One was the whole idea of, in technique, surface before depth, and defense before impulse, the importance of defense analysis, and watching carefully the response to interpretation. In addition to that, Hartman began with his group to change theory. And the theory about the conflict-free sphere became in itself very problematic and controversial. Arlo and Brenner insisted that conflict was always present. For Hartman, the conflict-free sphere was very important. Today, I think there are still different points of view about that, but the prevailing view seems to be, just like we all keep having conflict in our dreams and fantasies, that conflict is pervasive and never quite completely disappears. The tension that built up, and I have just a few more minutes perhaps, the tension that built up between the Americans and the Europeans, and the Europeans had made major contributions, but there was all kinds of competition as well as collaboration. And there was a certain distrust that these uncultured Americans, not used to analytic challenge and not really able to stand up to the intellectual challenges the way the Europeans were, not really fully scholarly, were not able to carry on the torch to the next generation. And there was a kind of, let us say, supercilious attitude towards many of the upstart so-called Americans. The Americans on their side looked up to many of their former teachers in Europe, idealized them, and were both awed and intimidated by them. So there's this very strange, complicated relationship. Please bear in mind that I'm only highlighting just a few of the important issues. This is all vastly overdetermined. The tensions that went on evolved into one particular area that really needs to be thought about, even now and in the future. All the splits that had gone on before in Europe were always around a number of issues, but one was central. Who had the power to appoint training analysts, and who had the power to appoint faculty? This evolved into a particular problem here. And I'll just cite the Brenner Amendment in the early 1970s, which was about who would be elected to the EC and who would therefore control the appointment of training analysts. That was a kind of sub rosa topic. But the issue, which remains a very important problem today throughout the world, the issue of the control of training analyst appointment and the narcissistic issues of power and prestige were undercurrents that were very, very powerful. Otto Isekauer, who was head of the Education Committee, really absolutely distrusted most of the younger analysts, felt that they couldn't possibly really know what real analysis was. They didn't understand the Isekauer phenomenon, another issue. As you may know, his distrust went so far as that when he died, he left all his money in his library to Hebrew University and nothing to the New York Society and Institute. The problems persisted, and over time, they gradually were overcome, I think, to a large degree. And here, I think, the Institute grew. There was a developmental transformation. One of the problems with the ego psychology point of view, in addition to the massive contributions they made, was they tended to downgrade and depreciate other points of view, in perhaps three important ways. One was narcissism was interpreted Oedipally. The big, powerful father, the Oedipal mother, not narcissism in its own right, beginning with infantile omnipotence and self-esteem and so forth. A second aspect was a tendency to view early pathology, highly dysfunctional persons, in terms of Oedipal pathology almost completely. So the Oedipus complex in those days became almost a Procrustean bed in which all psychopathology was located. The antecedents were not given much importance, and much of the pathology was viewed as a regression from the Oedipus complex. And the appreciation of the pre-Oedipal, the roots of the personality, would later come to the fore. I remind you that Freud in the 1937 analysis, Terminable and Interminable, talked about the fact that everyone has a psychotic core, those who are closer to it, those who are further from it, and so forth. Freud, ahead of his time as usual, really anticipated the borderline personality. Many of the personalities that we see today who are so dysfunctional and come from dysfunctional families clearly are rooted in pre-Oedipal psychopathology. So in time, the ego psychology began to fade. The world, and including our world right here, began to look elsewhere and began to appreciate the importance of other points of view. And gradually, the Institute here, leading the way, but it was occurring over the country, began to consider that there were other points of view. There was a heterogeneous, not simply a homogeneous, so-called ego psychology. And let me leave you with one final note. A favorite quote of Freud and Charcot, one of their adages, in our days now of heterogeneity rather than a homogeneous ego psychology, theories are fine, but they don't prevent the facts from existing.
Am I too close to the mic or too far from it? Wave.
You're equidistant.
Can you hear me back there? Okay. If you can't hear me, raise your hand. The previous two speakers have talked about the effect of the immigration. And I'd like to just mention a few things about that. During the 1940s and 50s and 60s, the New York Psychoanalytic contained, this is no exaggeration, the greatest concentration of analytic talent in the history of psychoanalysis. The world of psychoanalysis had never seen anything like it, nor since. There was an emotional dimension to it. The members of the New York Psychoanalytic developed an institutional narcissism. They became proud of their membership. They believed that they belonged to something that had enormous value. The rest of the psychoanalytic world and the greater mental health community reflected these internal attitudes. They looked to the New York Psychoanalytic with admiration and attributed to it authority. That was the positive reaction. The negative reaction was of resentment and sometimes even hatred. The New York Psychoanalytic was seen as elitist, snobbish, rigid, dogmatic, authoritarian, and simply unfriendly. These emotional attitudes persist to the present day, though in an attenuated form. I think it would be good to view the events that our panelists will describe as having this emotional backdrop. It may help to understand better our history. Thank you. I'd like to turn over the mic now to Sandy.
How's this adjustment? Is it okay? When I was invited over a year ago to participate tonight, I thought I was going to be interviewed to do some sort of memoir. I didn't realize that the focus would be on the evolution and fate of this particular institute and its attendant theoretical posture. So I scratched a few notes, and I'm going to tell my memoir, which will touch on some of these questions, but it's not focused on it. I was a candidate from 67 to 70. I was thrilled to be accepted. In those days, it was no-brainer, because I heard stories like, we have 10 applicants for every accepted place, not like today. The tales of the early troubles that Harold summarized, I heard nothing about that in those days. I was immersed in being a student and trying to learn. I knew nothing about Horney and Rado and their revolutions until much later when I was able to read history. And it didn't matter. We were focused on trying to learn psychoanalysis. It was old-fashioned Freudian psychoanalysis, as you've heard, through the filter of the ego psychology evolution. I thought that I should give you a brief list of the names of some of the teachers, as Leon just referred to, because I was so proud of it. At the American, where I was involved, I would talk about it. It was like we had an all-star team. I'll read you the names of some in alphabetical order. Jack Arlo, Ravi Bach, David Barris, Ted Becker, Peter Blow Sr., Charlie Brenner, Bernie Brodsky, Chuck Fisher, Manny Fuhrer, Milt Horowitz, Otto Issakover, Edith Jacobson, Ed Joseph, Rudy Lowenstein, Arnold Pfeffer, Bert Lewin, Martin Stein, Walter Stewart, Nick Young were all active teachers in my candidacy. Hartman and Greenacre were still around. They were presences, but they were in the background for the most part. I was graduated in 1970. At the time of my graduation, I had 8 cases in analysis. And that may sound shocking today, but it wasn't so bloody unusual. And I had 8 cases in analysis for the rest of my career until I stopped taking analytic patients. There was, of course, friction between the old European Guard and their American cohorts and the newer Americans. It was not relevant to me at that time. I only learned about it afterwards because it didn't influence the learning atmosphere here, or for that matter, the scientific meetings, which, as we were reminded at dinner, were twice a month, well attended, and generally had papers by members of the society who were scholarly and interested in writing and teaching. I don't remember arguments about the points of view, although there was sometimes a certain disagreement, but it was, in general, as my recollection, quite respectful. What's of interest as I tried to think about the mission of this meeting was that when I was a student and for some time thereafter, countertransference was not a technical tool that we were taught to utilize. At that time, the debates were still going on between the Kleinians and others who had introduced the notion in the 50s and the strict Freudians who, as following Freud, said countertransference is an interference on the part of the analyst. This is not reliable. And I think those debates were open. They went on for 10 years or so. I can't tell you exactly when it was resolved. I know when I gave my Brill lecture, it was already the case that the notion of countertransference had triumphed over the reservations and had become accepted, although in a more general rather than the specific Kleinian way, as an important feature of the way analysts had to think about clinical material. Perhaps the most important thing that I was involved with, I became a training analyst in '80 and did various things, teaching in committees and so on, including being president of society. Harold mentioned the focus on the power of the appointment of training analysts and so on. By the way, just an aside, I had a conversation a couple of years ago with a colleague from Latin America who was a representative to the IPA's Committee on Ethics. And he said to me, "You Americans, you think that ethics have to do with sexual transgressions of the analyst. We in Europe and South America know it has to do with the abuse of power." Interesting. Huh? At any rate, there was a grumbling. Certainly, it became louder during my early years on the faculty about the fact that the training analyst system was a mystery. We were tapped, as it were. I got a call one time from the then head of the EC that I'd been selected and would I accept the job. I don't know anybody ever turned it down, but no one had any idea who was considered, how they were considered, who was rejected, and so on. I was part of a small committee. Joan Earl was on it. Marty Willick, I think, was the chair. I don't remember who all. We met for a year and proposed a different system for the evaluation and selection of training analysts. It was adopted in '86. I have a copy of it here, which I had to dig out of the library because I didn't remember exactly. But it included a publication of the requirements, immersion, experience, and so on. A person could nominate himself or herself. There was a committee whose composition and election was described openly. And each applicant was asked to present material to a couple of different consultants who would then report to the committee before decisions were made. I'm sure it didn't resolve all the narcissistic issues, particularly of people who were unfortunate enough to be turned down. But it made the atmosphere about the way this was done change, I think, dramatically. I don't think that's an overstatement. As far as I know, the system is still in force. I don't know. I haven't been in touch lately. But it was a significant change in the way things operated here. Almost finished. It's really necessary for me to say that a stroke of fortune put me into the position of sharing an office space with Charlie Brenner right after I graduated. Now, he was my first instructor, and I was as terrified of him as everybody else was in those days. But we became friends, and more than friends. He was my mentor, a guide, and we spent a lot of time together. And there were a number of years when I would drive him into work from Scarsdale, where we both lived at that time. And on one of those trips, I brought up a question to him about forming a study group in which clinical material would be presented to more than one so-called expert. As far as I know, that had never been done. There were islands of individual influence. Charlie went for it, and we got Leo Stone to agree, and Manny Furo, though Manny never accepted the notion of being a professor. And we had a dozen of us, some of whom I see here tonight. We met monthly for a number of years in this postgraduate study group and presented material, and for a couple of years at least, we heard different opinions about clinical material. And some of this stuff was written up by Janet Malcolm in that celebrated, maybe now forgotten series that she did in the New Yorker. She interviewed various people from this group. I was not one of them. I had no idea about it. At any rate, it became an interesting place and certainly a breeding ground for future leaders, and I was told many years later it therefore became resented like the secret societies of yore and of education committees in times past. But that wasn't the point as far as we were concerned. We were interested in hearing clinical material discussed and presented by interested young analysts and discussed by senior people. It was really quite fascinating. I heard many tales from Charlie, as Harold mentioned, about Jack Arlo. about the early days and some of the frictions. I'm not terribly interested in repeating them, even if I remember them clearly. I don't think it adds very much to our task or to the present situation. I was certainly very active in the American and the international both for a number of years. Many of our people were in years past, fewer during my time, I must say. I don't exactly know why that is, but I enjoyed the stimulation of meeting people from elsewhere, and I didn't encounter quite as much of that sense of envy and antagonism about New York. Well, maybe because I was thoroughly immersed in my own sort of group narcissism, so I wouldn't have cared what they said. I can't say for sure. I think I'll stop now.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity to reconnect and to honor the excellence of your society and institute. I shall try to leave strife to others. Although there are many reasons for wanting to participate, not least that my parents joined your numbers nearly 75 years ago, and that it was a center point of their professional lives, it would be less than candid to deny that the welcome chance to be the youngest participant on a panel is pretty hard to come by these days.
That's why we write it down.
The original plan, as I understood it, was to have a free discussion. And I had hoped to skate by as the local guys did the heavy lifting. But lately came an edict. Quote, "The co-moderators, Harold Blum and Leon Balter, have decided they would like each panelist to speak for 10 minutes to make a statement that will be both informative and stimulate discussion." End quote. And so my hand has been forced. It reminded me of an occasion nearly 20 years ago at the Sigourney Trust dinner. I was minding my own business, sitting with friends, having the first course, when along came Bernie Pasella, who in those days was the whole Sigourney show. He told me that I was to introduce Leo Stone, who was receiving one of the awards. No joke, no preparation. I think Bernie chose me to represent my father, who had been Leo's third analyst. But I had known Leo myself for over 40 years, and we were then several years into a monthly discussion group on long-term psychoanalysis, for which I shall always be grateful to the Psychoanalytic Research and Development Fund. Harold was part of that group too, as was Bernie, my cousin Henry Nunberg. I admired Leo enormously. Whenever some question would come up in our group about how to proceed or what was going on in the analysis, Leo would invariably see it from the patient's viewpoint. And of course, I knew Leo as the author of The Psychoanalytic Situation, his Freud Anniversary Lecture in 1961, and of his earlier Arden House paper, The Widening Scope of Indications for Psychoanalysis. That was 1954. And both of those were very formative to my development as an analyst. So, faced with the need to take a position this evening, I want to speak about some of Leo Stone's contributions, which represent a major example of excellence from this Society Institute. I'm aware that some have disagreed with Leo's views, but for most, I am bringing coals to Newcastle. There may be a very few, however, who do not have my familiarity, or viewpoint about the psychoanalytic scene into which Leo's humanity and understanding made such a deep imprint. I am referring to the professional psychoanalytic scene of the 1950s, which for me is quite different from the many wonderful and beloved psychoanalysts whom I knew from childhood days on. How could those deeply caring people have adopted and tolerated the remarkably antiseptic and too often damaging psychoanalysis they practiced, at least with adults? Child analysis was quite different. Why, when they so revered Sigmund Freud, did they reject his open style of analysis and joke among themselves that he could never have been accepted for analytic training then? They channeled their love into the attempt to understand their patients, but I believe they often failed to grasp the total situation in which they were doing so. In great part, I believe that in rejecting Freud's style, they were following other precepts of his, which can be found throughout his writings, to aim for a detached, scientific psychoanalysis, which so suited the technological zeitgeist, but so curiously denied the subjective side of the intellectual revolution he created. There's much more to be said about that topic, which has been debated and discussed over and over again. But for now, I want to return to Leo Stone's Freud Anniversary Lecture of 1961, The Psychoanalytic Situation, an intellectually rigorous study undertaken with a powerful subtext of humanizing psychoanalytic practice. Anyone who has known Leo or read his writings, and you do not read Leo Stone for his prose style, will recognize his reluctance to say an unkind word about anyone. So in his attempts to humanize the analytic relationship, he would refer to a time long ago in which some analysts, my father explicitly exempted, would take to excess Freud's surgical metaphor and his directive to act like a mirror in maintaining abstinence and anonymity. It was my experience, in contradistinction to what Leo wrote, that the blank screen attitude toward patients in the service of reducing gratification to a dusty minimum did not yield to a more human psychoanalytic setting until the 1970s, a little later in some hands. In those years of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, analysts did not hold the recommended equidistance from the three psychic agencies, so far as I could see. They took a position far too close to the superego. When Leo wrote that he would reveal his summer location to a patient, or acknowledge that he was familiar with sailing, he was bravely risking the challenge of excommunication as an unorthodox apostate. No doubt some, especially those too young to remember, will think I am exaggerating. But it was for this reason that Anna Freud's stamp of approval of Leo's widening scope paper at the Arden House conference meant so much to him. Anna Freud, like her father, always held that the real relationship with the patient and analyst, between the patient and analyst, could be seen as distinct from the transference relationship. So in her view, Leo was in agreement. For me, it is problematic to imagine that transference can be truly separate from the real relationship, or that one is real and the other unreal. I'm not sure that Leo was in agreement with Anna Freud. However, because his subsequent postscript on transference and the psychoanalytic situation in 1971 demonstrates something quite different. I may be reading my own views into Leo's, but I believe he was saying that a human relationship is necessary for the full development of the transference. He believed that the primordial transference was the attempt through words to reconnect, the irredentist tendency, a geopolitical term he was fond of, as in the return of the Crimea to Russia. I understood him to mean that the ordinary human relationship permitted the primordial transference to develop and to fuel the analytic process, and that the antiseptic tendency in psychoanalysis tended to distort the transference, to create anger rather than negative transference. Naturally, the human relationship, like any analytic measure, can also be used to avoid and hence undermine the analytic process. One can get too real. I believe that the warmer climate Leo advocated, and everyone knows that things grow better in the tropics than the Arctic, has fostered truthfulness and permitted better, deeper analysis of negative transference than before. Leo was, of course, not alone in humanizing psychoanalytic practice. Though the later revisions of self-psychology with its affirmative attitude had a still greater impact on the stance of American psychoanalysts, some, but not all of which were salutary, Leo's solution, which retained a theory of conflict in analytic work, seems far preferable to me. There is, of course, much more to say about Leo Stone's deep understanding of the analytic situation, of the relationship of speech to the primordial transference. You can take that. And of the forward thrust in what he called the mature transference. Time will not permit that now.
Tony's comment about his being the youngest forces me to suggest that we don't want this degenerated into a Jack Lemmon, Walter Matthau movie of grumpy old men complimenting each other. We're odd couples. In thinking about this, I had to go over my sources and what I knew about the history of ideas here at the Institute and what has been going on recently in the political readings I do and my deleting messages all day long from people I don't want to hear from. And what does our intellectual life have to do with what's going on in regard to this whole political process? And I thought of being in the university and somebody telling me that if you're in a class on the Renaissance, please don't write about the Renaissance, write about one day in the life of Leonardo da Vinci. And how do you do that when you're talking about a broad sweep? Well, Harold gave us the broad sweep from the beginning to the middle. And what I did actually initiating this was I thought of a few sources that I knew about. One was my own experience, and that follows a time span of having been a candidate here on the Board of Trustees, a secretary of the Institute, so forth, which probably ran from 1960 through the early mid-70s. My tenure as editor of the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association, 1982-3 to 92. And the other vantage point comes from having 1 foot here and 1 foot in a university. One of the things that I have done throughout my life is spend a lot of my day at a medical college teaching and so forth. And one of the reasons I'm here at the New York Psychoanalytic Institute is probably because I had a teacher like John Frosch, who was also at the university, my residency director, and made it imperative that I go to analytic training. In fact, I went to this analytic institute because of him, rather than going to my brother's analytic institute at Columbia, because I wanted to hear it from the horse's mouth. Those who had apostolic succession from Freud himself. And it turned out to be a rather good and interesting choice. But being at the college during the day and watching what went on in the evenings here gave me another vantage point, which is the arguments and fights that occurred at the Analytic Institute occurred because they were listening all day long and we were fighting all day long. So the matters of vantage point became terribly important. Another source was a wonderful paper written by John Frosch, my teacher, that I published when I was editor, called The New York Psychoanalytic Civil War, which recounts the breakaways that Harold was talking about, the early years of consolidation, the newcomers from Europe, the new wave from here. By the way, we got our original group of analysts not from psychiatry, but from neurology. Jack Arlo, Brenner, lots of people came from neurology, not from psychiatry. Psychiatrists were alienists. They were at state hospitals and doing stuff like that. It's only in our generation that we became psychiatry residents and we began to move in here. The other thing is that in those years, most of us were physicians who went into psychoanalysis. And in so doing, we not only were privy to, but also authors of the American Psychoanalytic's notion that this was a medical organization. And the later intrusions of the demand that psychologists be introduced into the fold, the lawsuit that occurred later on, was a very important stepping stone for both the decline of the medical population going in, but also the resurgence of another kind of analytic attitude in regard to our colleagues. So professionalism became a very important issue, and as you can see now, if we read any of these blogs, it's the professionalism issue of certification that's become a hot topic for us in this time. It wouldn't have been a hot topic if we had maintained our professionalism in another way. Now, the issue of, for example, certification came up within medicine. There was a time when the subspecialty boards in medicine considered a specialty board in psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis was that prominent and important an area in the psychiatry departments. I want to bring that to your mind. Now, it isn't as though in the 60s we didn't have psychologists in the Institute. After all, George Klein, Don Spence, Pine, and Bob Holt were major theoretical mavens, and under Rappaport, with Schaffer also, they ran a very important element of our institute here, and we had a very strong representation not only of ego psychology but of research. Hartwig Dahl was the director of research here. Rubinstein ran a course in theoretical thinking and modeling, which was tantamount to high-level university activity. So it isn't as though we were only insularly ego psychologists. We were spread out, and the George Klein Forum at the American Psychoanalytic was a forum in which, I see Dr. Bachrach sitting back here, Thursday morning was the most crowded meeting you could go to. So it wasn't that we were just insular and apart from things. I had a course with my teacher here in language and psychoanalysis, and the language study group was highly active with Dr. Rosen. So he was my teacher. I ended up taking that over afterwards. I just don't want you to go away with the feeling that we were a bunch of stuffed shirts just thinking about ego psychology and that was all that there was. I think the biggest challenge intellectually came with the rise of Kohut. I think Kohut's introduction of the narcissistic personality disorders and the way in which his analytic approach was looking at his new language and self-psychology became the first important challenge. When I finished my stint at the American Psychoanalytic Association Journal, I wrote that when I started out, most of the papers that were coming in were written in the idiom of Margaret Mahler. We were beginning to get some things from Heinz Kohut. By the time I left, you couldn't get a citation to symbiosis, separation individuation, or even transmuting transformations, whatever the self-psychological thing is. We're beginning to hear, by 91, 92, of countertransference, enactments, the analytic third, and field theories. So, and intersubjectivity. And what I think of as the greatest oxymoron ever created, two-person psychology. The shift had already taken place, and the interest and change was already on deck. By that time, also, the lawsuit had been won. Psychologists were introduced into the possibility for training here and there. The medical schools began to lose their psychoanalytic representation, and young physicians began not to want to go to analytic training because they didn't know it. So there were many trends that were happening along the way other than our arrogance and our independence. That doesn't mean that there weren't arrogant people on both sides of the street. During my tenure here, by the way, I never felt that I was intellectually stifled. I did feel that some of my colleagues and my classmates, of whom there were, by the way, 11 or 12 of us, were rather dull. So some of the things, by the way, some weren't. My teachers were more exciting than the liveliness with which a class took place. And I think part of that was the zeitgeist of fear that a lot of young analysts felt in regard to not overstepping bounds. And for some reason, I never got it. So what were they afraid of? That doesn't mean there weren't prejudicial aspects in regard to what you needed to be in the higher ranks or to be a teacher, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a constant interplay between we were telling stories at dinner tonight about, and they were fun stories about the great European group who were here and how funny they were in many ways in the way in which they handled the classes. And it did seem sometimes a little bit obtuse, arrogant, and frightening. But in the end, they were puppy dogs. And they were really open to discussion. And if you had a supervisor who was of one of that ilk, you really learned how open they were. One of my supervisors who came from the European sector said to me, you know what we haven't learned in all these years of doing psychoanalysis? Who would do better in psychotherapy and who would do better in analysis? Still a major question in regard to what we do. So all I want to suggest to you is that during this middle period, the golden age, the period of Renaissance and so forth, it was knocked down by new ideas in regard to people like Stone, Kohut, Kernberg coming to New York, some new ideas which then became challenging, but it also fit nicely with the transition to the demedicalization of psychoanalysis and the movement into a broader scope, a group of people who were becoming psychoanalysts. And the transition was a historical one. The other reminiscence we had was, you hear today that our meetings are relatively empty at the Institute. By the way, I'm glad to see all these people here tonight. I'm sure it's to see Anton, Kris, but it's okay.
You can call me Tony, Ted, with no known each other.
But when I was a candidate, and Sandy will agree, and I think Leon also, the room was packed. And a lot of it was to come and see the greats. There was a lot of stargazing. I mean, it was great to watch Max Schur and Heinz Hartmann talk to each other on the podium and not to the audience, and nobody heard what they said, but it was good to see them. And that was a rather typical exchange. And we were as busy as the candidates are now. I went to class 3 nights a week. My family lived in New York. I made sure to get home for dinner every evening, so I saw my kids, and then I went to a Tuesday night meeting. I don't know why people don't. But by the way, most of the papers were given by people from the Institute, too. So there was a large, fervent interest in writing and in producing and talking to each other. I think I'm going to leave it there.
I'd just like to say a brief word about the impact of self-psychology. It's a misrepresentation to think that people here, intellectual leaders, were so convinced of their own point of view and superiority that they paid no attention to new ideas. A number of us, Charlie Brenner, who was not the most flexible thinker ever, but he was quicker and better at it than most people you ever want to meet. He and I, we read the poet's book, and talked about it, and had a lot of questions. We had a large study group that arranged to invite John Gatto, who was a leading self-psychologist, to come here and to present a case. It was a whole Saturday that we spent doing that. And I'm going to tell you this story because it speaks to some of the, in a way, to some of the issues that you've heard about. Gatto described an analysis in which his analysand was a graduate student who had a PhD thesis, and he very much wanted his analyst to read the thesis. And Gatto struggled with this a little bit. And finally he said, and he described some of the material to us. He said, well, finally I said I would read it, but I wouldn't tell him what I thought of it. Well, in the discussion, some of our hardliners, I guess I consider myself among them, had some questions about this resolution. But in the discussion, it turned out that one of the people in our group raised the question for Gatto. He said, Dr. Gatto, hadn't it occurred to you or did come up with the analysis that this fellow's wanting you to read his thesis was something like, an unconscious fantasy of having your child and wanting you to share it with? And Gatto looked at this fellow and he said, you people in New York, that's all you think about is sex. True.
Any other? First, we've heard some wonderful discourse from a fellow panelist, and I did want to just bring up the fact that there was always a disparity historically between what Freud wrote at a particular time, and one has to read Freud in terms of early Freud, middle Freud, and late Freud, and what he actually did. Reading in the Freud archives, it's absolutely apparent that Freud never adhered to a strictly mirror type of analytic situation. He didn't hesitate to give advice, as he did to the Wolfman. What? And Frink. He would say to some of his patients, one returning to New York from Vienna, give my regards to another patient, call her up, and so forth. So there were all kinds of remarks like that all the time. Freud was very humanistic in his practice, probably from the earliest days, because if you go back to the letters that Freud wrote to his proto-analyst, you can see just the human side of Freud all the time. Brash, yes. Bold, yes. But always very human. Always concerned about the human side of the relationship with the patient. The part that we've heard about that's very important, I think, and I just want to stress, is where Freud in the early days viewed the countertransference as essentially a blind spot, a focal blind spot, not something that was part of a transference, countertransference field. And it really is true that the current views of the countertransference did not arise here in New York. They didn't arise in the United States. They came largely from Latin America with Heinz Racker and from the middle group in England. This view that the countertransference could be used to better our understanding of the patient. What is the patient doing to make us feel anxious, to make us feel aroused, to make us feel angry, and so forth, gives us a further insight into the patient and what's going on in the transference. Of course, it's a compromise formation and very complicated because there are other issues, as the analyst's own unconscious, dating back from childhood. But the change was very dramatic. And this was one of the reasons that I was so glad, I think it was Sandy who mentioned it, that one of the limitations of ego psychology and structural psychology at that time was insufficient attention to the countertransference and seeing it as part of a broader issue than just a focal blind spot. And I think that was a major advance in psychoanalytic thought and technique. It was also allied with an unfortunate development in another direction, which was that those who emphasized the countertransference began to think only in terms of the here and now, as if everything happened only in the here and now, and there was no historic past to be dealt with. So the importance of childhood was vitiated. And I remind you of Freud's admonition, those who overlook the childhood of the patient are bound to make the most egregious errors.
I think we can open up the discussion to the floor.
Yes. We have some time. We have a little bit. Whenever. I'd actually like to, first of all, thank you, all of you, very much for very, very interesting, rich presentations. I would like to begin this Q&A with a question myself. Can anybody address the chronological history and the intellectual history of course candidacy here? Course candidacy here. What made course candidates acceptable to the New York and what made them no longer acceptable to New York? Course candidates are when an institute receives a waiver from the American Psychoanalytic Association to allow somebody with a doctorate in another field to train, to do clinical training here. When I arrived in 2000 and something, I guess 2003 maybe, I was encouraged to be a course candidate. I chose not to be at the time for a number of reasons that I don't need to get into. And when I finished 5 years here, at that point, I had very good experience here, and I wanted at that point to become a course candidate, and I wanted to do the full clinical training. There was no such thing as a scholars program when I arrived here. I believe with one or two other people was instrumental in getting that set up. And at the end of my training in 2008, I really wanted to become a course candidate, and there was no longer such a thing. We were the only institute in New York, only institute of the American that I can think of that was not accepting course candidates. And so I'm just curious as to what the evolution of that was, since there's been so much discussion tonight of what is more Freudian than Freud and what is humanistic training.
I mentioned George Klein and Bob Holt and that group of people. We have a number of people in our audience now who I'm sure were course candidates. I see one or two back there and so forth. Leo Goldberger was in my class and so forth. One of the stipulations of the course program was that you went to class, but you didn't become a practicing analyst. They didn't want them to become, I don't know, it wasn't competitive necessarily. It was just the idea that they were here for the analytic education, but that the practice of analysis should be reserved for the physicians in the group. And of course, that became an anathema and a difficulty for many people who wanted to come here to train fully and so forth. And people like Fred Pine just took off, and who's going to stop him, so to speak? Because they did have some training with training analysts and so forth and so on, and also with some supervision in their work. One of the biggest problems with non-clinical course candidates, Lois, I'm sure you hit that and so forth. I remember somebody in the audience I remember, is trying to get clinical cases for them when they didn't have any license to practice. And that's the professionalism part of the conflict about course candidates who came from other venues. Now, Tony's father came from the arts. He was a art historian and so forth. So there obviously were glitches in the way in which they handled it. And Peter Bloss Jr. was a physician. He became a candidate here, but his father wasn't permitted to be, but he was a practicing analyst here in the city anyway and became an honorary member later on. I don't know the ins and outs of how the American and New York did anything further.
But I'm speaking, is that it?
I don't know.
Well, it's obvious to everybody there have been non-physician analysts from the beginning. For instance, in Boston, our first major training analyst was Hunt Sachs, a lawyer. So that was easy. What was a problem was that in this country there were tremendous numbers of charlatans. And the medical schools early in the century, the 20th century, had really become rigorous. So it was natural for Brill and others to impose the medical training on psychoanalysis. And there were a number of factors involved in changing that. One was, Ted went over the change in the number of medical graduates who were interested. The lawsuit. The lawsuit's the best thing that ever happened to us as far as I was concerned. But a variety of changes softened the old attitude, the revision of the Constitution of the American. So, of course, there were all the time non-MD analysts. And Leo Stone talks about that a lot. Today, nobody talks about it. It's taken for granted. I did want to comment on one other thing that Ted outlined, the changes in papers. And I remember as a reviewer, it went from Freud and I to Winnicott and I. There was a whole genre called Winnicott and I. And that disappeared. Everything changes. Right now, everything is Beyond and I. Yeah. And he won't last either. He's having his day, and it's wonderful. We did not read Bion, and we did not read Melanie Klein in my institute, and I doubt that you read them here. But you tell me the truth.
I did not read Bion, and I try to read Bion now, and I don't understand anything. Now, that's a problem for me. Either I am so fixed in the rigidity of the ego-psychological model that I no longer am able to understand anything, or I'm getting too old to do something that I didn't do in my childhood. But some of these people, we had an exercise at the American Psychoanalytic. We handed out a paper by Bion for everybody to critique to see whether they would accept it in these days. They didn't give a title to who wrote it. It was an interesting discussion. There were a lot of people like myself who weren't sure they understood what was in it. So there's a problem in language shift even. And those become issues that I'm not sure I understand how that happens and so forth. Similar thing with countertransference and the rise of the bringing the Kleinians to New York with projective identification. Lots of American analysts don't know how to deal with that and don't quite understand how the Kleinians know so intimately the insides of somebody else through the hearing of what the patient says. So there are lots of theoretical issues that are genuine issues in regard to comprehension and practice, but also in regard to what is dominant in each of the areas.
I'd just like to add about the Bion question. No, it was not part of our curriculum here. I think that changed somewhat more recently. I know Manny was interested in teaching at least some familiarity with other points of view. But I can tell you that one summer, X years ago, because I had never read any of Bion, I made it my business to spend a month reading his case book, not his theoretical book. K and Alpha and all that was too much for me, but his case book I did read from cover to cover. And I want to tell you something. I really encourage anybody who is fascinated by his point of view and interested in what he had to say to do the same. He was analyzing psychotic patients, quote analyzing. And in the material that he presented to my reading, the gap between what the patients were saying to him as he reported it and what he had to say about what they said was not a transverse that I could follow. Now, it's true that I was devoted to a school of thought that paid a lot of attention to the connection between the perceived material and what the analyst had to say. But as I said earlier about the cohort and the self-psychologist, it's not that we didn't try to understand what other people were talking about, but to try and come to a conclusion that this is not something that fits into my way of thinking about the clinical analytical work. That was my experience with Bion's casebook. And by the way, I was on I was a representative in the American to the committee that had to make a decision about the lawsuit. And Joel Klein, of later fame, was the lawyer who represented the American, and he made it very clear. He said, there are a number of ways in which this lawsuit has no chance, but there are some ways in which it could go against you and destroy the structure. So, however reluctantly, our administration voted to change the way things happen, and that it worked out in a very fortuitous way for everybody. It could have been predicted, perhaps, but I heard that the history of the focus on medical, I heard it from Charlie Brenner, so this is clearly secondhand, is after the war there was a great concern among the analysts to solidify their ties to the medical community, many of whom had been exposed to analytic thinking for the very first time in military service during World War II, when psychiatrists met people who had psychodynamic backgrounds. So it was very popular. Heads of departments were psychoanalysts, and they were teaching psychodynamic psychotherapy. You have to remember the medications came in only in the late 50s. So the political decision in the American was to solidify our tentative growing bonds with American medicine. We should make this regulation about medical background, which was very much against the international, because, as you know, lay and analysts had been prominent from the very beginning. And as a matter of fact, it was one of the things that led to the fact that the American Psychoanalytic Society had its separate relationship to the international, different from any other, because we had our own system, so to speak. And it took a number of years for that to erode.
Just to clarify, I was not making the distinction between medical and non-medical background. I was making a distinction between humanities doctorates and non-psychological training, non-clinical training, and clinical training.
I think I would speak to what, at least is my understanding from the admissions committee, of what happened more recently about course candidates. I mean, I don't know whether the data is correct, but I know for a fact this is what the admissions committee understood about it, which is with HIPAA regulations, we used to, for course candidates, have them undergo about 6 months of training in some kind of, psychiatric hospital, where we would get an agreement for people to go and train in basic diagnosis, psychopathology, et cetera, so that they would see psychotic patients, organic brain syndromes, things like that. And with HIPAA regulations, we could no longer send somebody with a non-mental health degree onto the units. It was no longer allowed. So we, at least my understanding of it was, and this came up with a number of people who were applying, we had no way to get such people an exposure to more basic psychiatric training before taking them on for analytic training.
That's interesting that you say that because the issue of the LP Training Institute was what was happening at the same time that I had my own experience of finishing here. And I, in fact, was able to get clinical experience by becoming a visiting scholar at PI, Psychiatric Institute, and did undergo the full training, the HIPAA training there, and spent a year there. But then that same year, it all turned into an LP question, and I don't need to spend any more time talking about myself here, so I will pass this on to Henry Nunberg.
Yeah, I just wanted to tell you one thing about what you were saying, Sandy, about the after the war. My father did not become a member of this institute until 1940, and he had come to this country in 1931, long before, and to New York in 1936. And he wasn't admitted, wasn't able to become a member because he refused to agree to promise not to train non-medical people. So that was an issue at that time as well.
Thank you. I'm Jeff Golland. I guess I count myself among the excluded. I trained at the New York Freudian Society under one of its former names from 68 to 73. I had my doctorate in the Research Center for Mental Health with George Klein, Bob Holt, Leo Goldberger, Donald Spence. These were my doctoral teachers. When I was at the New York Freudian Society as a candidate, I had friends who were here. Leo Stone was not a radical to us. We were reading Leo Stone very receptively, nor was countertransference the same as it was here. After all, Racker published in the early 60s. Kernberg wrote an integrative paper in 65 or 68. We were studying those papers. We had what has become a current view, and when I spoke with my friends here who were in assigned reporting analyses that weren't real analyses, we knew
had I been a physician, I would have applied here, but I really felt during the time that I was getting clearly a better training. We read the Middle European group. I still don't understand Bion. I'm very familiar with the work of the people on the platform, and I respect it and read it and studied it at that time. My sympathies are with the theory as it's evolved today in this institute. What I wonder about is why this institute remains an alumni association, and where I feel a great affinity for what goes on here, I'm not eligible for membership.
Yes, it seems apropos after the last discussion. I was wondering about the panel's view about the role of social workers and psychologists who seem to attach themselves to Melanie Klein. And even here in the discussion, where we just heard a little bit about Bion, but otherwise it was Kohut. Kohut seemed to be somebody who was had to be dealt with by our place. But as far as I know, I graduated in '63. So maybe that's antediluvian sufficiently so that I cannot answer my own question about Melanie Klein. But even as a matter of fact, Sandy, Charlie Brenner put Bion down terribly right in this audience. He said anybody, that phrase of Bion's, to approach the patient without memory, desire, right. And he said anybody.
Desire.
I'm sorry?
The phrase was without memory or desire.
Yes, correct. Memory or desire. And he said anybody who said that, says such a thing can be dismissed. Now that was directly what he said. We were and that was, of course, a difficult person to abstract as he is, to read. But it wasn't for that reason. He could read it. He disagreed and he dismissed. And I think in a certain way that's what Harold was speaking about. That attitude that I do think had to be here. And with certain, you see, to go back to the Freudian Society, IPTAR, they went over to England for supervision. They brought the English here for supervision. That very much influenced the psychoanalytic community, I think. And it didn't seem to penetrate our I don't know now because I'm simply not close enough to it. But it seemed to me that particular author, Melanie Klein, who after all made a tremendous advance into the area that Freud said couldn't be analyzed, narcissistic neuroses, well, we didn't hear anything about it.
The interest in Melanie Klein goes way back. It wasn't that nobody was interested. Remember that the controversial discussions in England were a terribly important moment between the Anna Freud and Melanie Klein group, and then the middle group was formed along the way. So they were in a way in a schistic system living in the same house with a trinity of different points of view. When I did I never finished the child analytic training, but when I did my child analytic training, actually, thankfully with Tony's mother, we learned about Melanie Klein, but Melanie Klein did not follow the point of view of the Anna Klein group in regard to clinical issues. Parents were not included, which was a terribly important movement forward, it seemed to me, in regard to what analysis was about, in regard to countertransference, reality, counting for the fact that they had parents, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a legitimate clinical decision, I think, in the States that we were taught by people who were essentially in the Anna Freud tradition and therefore non-Kleinian with regard to the approach to things too. The person who really brought Klein to New York, as far as I'm concerned, is Schaffer. And when he came with his book on the new Kleinians, that opened up a whole bunch of stuff, as well as some of the hermeneutic movement that was so important to his vantage point. So that was late, though.
talk?
Because I do have to leave. Just a couple of anecdotes before I leave. One is the greater tolerance. First of all, Heinz Hartmann's 70th birthday. Heinz Kohut is walking out saying, "Heinz, Heinz, Heinz, why does everyone talk about Hartmann?" Now the idea that came forth, though, really was very important because, as we've heard, people like Klein, Bion, Lacan were not read and not really well understood. One really has to attempt to read them, give them a chance to present their viewpoint, and have the opportunity to make an assessment and evaluation of what they have to say. In the early days, Jung, Adler were essentially expelled, excommunicated. Later on, when self-psychology came forth, they were made part of the American Psychoanalytic Association, often represented on almost every panel. So there was a different tolerance and point of view, even one which we, for most of us, disagreed with. And as far as the attempt to understand it, I think it's very important. But I leave with this other anecdote. As far as I'm concerned, trying to read Lacan in the French is almost impossible. But in a debate with Lacanians, one can defeat them by saying, "You know, I understood your paper."
There are a number of points worth making, but I want to shift slightly back to excellence, because one of the things that makes this Society Institute excellent is the number of people who have written papers, who have there has been a tradition here of study. And I think one way to look at what the discussion has brought out is that, yes, each of these different ideas and phases gives way to the next. And that's almost as guaranteed as anything can be in human history. There's always new things. But the tradition of study, of serious teaching, of devotion to patients, even if they had it all wrong in some ways, that, I believe, has contributed to your excellence.
I have one comment in regard to the intellectual climate at our place. A few years ago, Henry Backrack and I did an article for the newsletter on the history of research and at the Institute. And I went back to the newsletters, going way back into the 60s, and I actually interviewed Ted for this piece. And what was really striking about the newsletter was that until the mid-70s, there were literally many articles about all the research that was happening in different places here. For example, Grossman was doing dream research up at Montefiore. So there was a lot of activity. And then somewhere in the mid-70s, Chuck Fisher resigned as chair of the research committee, and Ted quoted to me that Chuck said to him that you can't do research in night school. But what was really striking about the newsletter was that after that mid-70s period, the newsletter was filled with all this political stuff and bylaws and this kind of stuff. And it's sort of like there seemed to be a shift, it was my impression. There seemed to be a shift from an active intellectual climate to a kind of closing ranks of being much more concerned about standards and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I know Ted's perspective, but I wonder if, Sandy, did you have any experience in the mid-70s? What happened?
I'm sorry, I just thought of a joking memory. I'm a graduate of the University of Chicago, and Anton J. Carlson, who was one of the famous, before my time, physiologists who most of you, I think, may have heard of, and somebody gave a paper and he was sitting in the audience, and the chairman and moderator asked him to comment on the paper. So Carlson got up with his cane and came up to the microphone, and he said, I think he is wrong, and sat down. I cannot say with any confidence that the atmosphere here, in the 70s at least, was one of intellectual openness and curiosity. I've tried to make the point that in my later years that a number of us were very interested, at least, in engaging with people who thought differently. If the outcome of the engagement was to sort of reinforce our view that our point of view was not inferior and needn't be changed, that's another matter, but that's different from paying no attention to what's going on. I can't speak for the curriculum because it was after my time, so I don't know about that. And the whole question of research, some of us were always, uncertain. Woody Waldron's a buddy. He's been doing research for umpty years, and I don't know who takes it seriously because I think many of us who are analysts don't conveniently put ourselves into the intellectual role of researchers, right? We all acknowledge that our research consists of our own clinical experience with all of its limitations and essentially prejudices.
We have time for one more question.
I'm Arlene Heyman. I'm a member of the membership committee. We have a 4-person committee. And I wonder whether you could explain your point. I think you said that you can't become a member of the New York Psychoanalytic. Could you explain why? Because perhaps I can do something about it.
My understanding is that one has to be a graduate of the adult program here or of one of the American Psychoanalytic Association. If I'm wrong, I'd be happy to find that out.
One does not have to be a graduate of the adult program here. That is not true. Whether one has to be a member of the American, I can find out. You are a member of the American. So then there should be nothing to stop your... could you explain that difference? So, Henry, what... American. Okay, I have to look into that. But my heart is with you.
I just want to make one final comment about a lot of the difficulties that people have had about the New York Psychoanalytic, the American Psychoanalytic, the idea of certification are artifacts of the history of these organizations. They aren't written in stone, but they're written in the history. And yes, it was in the beginning an alumni organization, and the faculty was separate from the alumni organization. Other places are done differently. The American has, through BOPs and so forth, become a certifying organization. That's not the way most professional organizations work. And I just want you to understand that the whole issue of certification, which has been made so much of a mess of at this point, is not just for our professional identity, it's for the public. Somebody mentioned that there were lots of charlatans in the old days. Remember, American medicine, after the Flexner Report, became an exclusive club in 1905, I think it was. So it's a relatively new thing. Certification in specialties came about in 55, 56, after the Second World War. We entered the certification thing as a kind of afterthought. But again, everybody talks about it as, why are we measuring everybody else's doing? Why don't we trust everybody? We don't trust it's not that we don't trust everybody, it's not to protect us, it's to protect the public, which becomes another issue that I think is terribly important in regard to any professional group. The minute you take money from a person who's coming to you because they think you know something more than somebody else, you don't want them to fall into hands of charlatans. Now that means that you sometimes have exclusiveness that's problematic and wrong. But that's the way it's went.
Just a word, certification was grafted onto what had been, at least in my time, the requirement for membership in the American. When you were graduated from any institute, including this one, you were only a provisional member of the American Psychoanalytic Association for 2 years. If you wanted then to become a full member, you had to present your work to the membership committee, write up your cases, and be examined. Everybody resented it. I certainly did, but we did it. And by the way, I have to tell you, it was one of the best learning experiences of my career to write up my 4 cases at the time and learn something about that. But that's beside the point. We often learn that something's valuable after the fact. But in those days, that was a membership requirement of the American. It evolved into certification, but it was, and that's partly because, as I understand it, again, it's a history that I've just been told secondhand, there were certain societies which graduated individuals who didn't want any part of this membership review for one reason or another. There were also institutes whose graduates behaved in ways that a number of people thought were not terribly responsible, like stopping all their training cases. So the question of membership was the Americans' only lever by which it could exert any influence on certain institutes whose practices were at variance with the general ethos. That's the fairest way I can put it. That morphed into certification, but the resentment about it and the issues connected to it, real and emotional, certainly haven't gone away. It was part of my history during my time in the governance of the American, and I do still look at the emails and shake my head and wonder how much I could have persuaded myself that this was a worthwhile fight at the time that I was fighting it many years ago.
We change our minds.
Before we go too far from strife and excellence at the New York Psychoanalytic Institute to strife and excellence at the American Psychoanalytic Association, I think we'll call this meeting to a close, and I thank you very much for coming.